Crowned at 14, Charlotte of Cyprus held 3 crowns at once: Cyprus, Jerusalem, and Armenia. Yet behind the gold was a throne built on sand. Betrayed by her own blood, abandoned by allies, and forced into exile, she wandered Rome like a shadow of a queen. No battlefield ended her reign, no assassin's blade, only the slow suffocation of being forgotten. This is the story of a monarch who lost everything before she reached 43. Charlotte of Lusignan was born in Nicosia on June 28, 1444, into a world already fraying at its edges. Her father, King John II of Cyprus, reigned over an island that was both jewel and battlefield, a fragile remnant of the Crusader states. Her mother, Helena Palaiologina, carried the fading pride of Byzantium, that empire once hailed as eternal but now shrinking under Ottoman pressure. From the moment of her birth, Charlotte embodied 2 dynasties in decline: the Lusignans of Cyprus and the Palaiologoi of Byzantium. She was, in many ways, a child born between dying worlds. The court at Nicosia was both splendid and precarious. Venetian merchants moved through its streets, Genoese traders fought for influence, and emissaries from Cairo and Constantinople arrived with their veiled threats. Within the palace, Charlotte was raised among silks and ceremonies. But beyond its walls, Cyprus was a chessboard where larger powers played their games. Her existence was not simply personal, it was political, her very body carrying the weight of dynastic survival. As a daughter, she was precious, but she was also vulnerable. The Lusignan throne was not secure, and the possibility of male rivals loomed constantly. From early childhood, whispers about succession haunted her. The presence of her father's illegitimate son, James, cast a shadow over her future. Though his birth denied him legitimacy, politics was rarely bound by law alone. Ambition could be sharpened into a weapon, and James would one day wield it against her. Charlotte's education reflected the contradictions of her world. She was trained in languages, diplomacy, and courtly ritual, prepared for a future where her words might carry the weight of treaties. She inherited her mother's Byzantine pride and her father's Lusignan claim to knightly honor. Yet, beneath these lessons lay a harsher truth. Cyprus was no longer master of its destiny. The island survived at the mercy of foreign powers: Venice, Genoa, the Mamluks of Egypt, and soon, the rising Ottomans. In this crucible, Charlotte's childhood was less a time of innocence than of initiation. She grew up with the consciousness that her life was not her own, that she was a symbol before she was a girl. Her laughter echoed through corridors steeped in tension. Her prayers rose in chapels where political schemes brewed just outside the door. When she looked at the horizon from Nicosia's palace towers, she did not see freedom. She saw borders closing in, kingdoms crumbling, and the sea that both protected and imprisoned her. Born between kingdoms, Charlotte was already destined to walk a path where history's weight pressed harder than any crown she would ever wear. Charlotte's childhood was lived in a palace where marble columns gleamed in sunlight, but cracks ran deep beneath the surface. Cyprus, though small, was a prize too tempting to ignore. The Venetians, the Genoese, and the Egyptians all wanted its harbors, its trade routes, its symbolic place in the lingering story of the Crusades. For the young princess, this meant that her home was never free from suspicion, never safe from foreign eyes. Inside the court, her mother, Helena Palaiologina, wielded sharp influence. A Byzantine princess by birth, Helena was proud, uncompromising, and determined to keep her daughter secure. But her assertiveness bred enemies. Nobles muttered against her. Foreign ambassadors saw an opportunity to exploit division. Charlotte grew up watching her mother navigate intrigue with both grace and fire, absorbing lessons about how a queen must fight not only on battlefields, but also in whispered conversations behind velvet curtains. Her father, King John II, was less commanding. His reign was marked by weakness, and his inability to silence dissent left space for rivals to flourish. Chief among them was James, his illegitimate son, who was acknowledged yet resented. Though branded the bastard, James gained sympathizers among nobles who despised Helena's Byzantine influence. For Charlotte, his existence was a living threat, proof that her path to the throne would never be clear. As she matured, Charlotte learned that trust was a rare currency. Courtiers bowed to her, but their loyalty was conditional, shifting like the tides. Some whispered that a girl could never hold Cyprus against the storms gathering on the horizon. Others hinted that James might be a stronger hand, a more convenient king. For a child, these undercurrents were suffocating. Her very identity was contested before she could even wield power. Beyond the palace walls, dangers multiplied. The Ottomans pressed deeper into Byzantine lands, tightening their grip on Constantinople. The Mamluks monitored Cyprus closely, ready to strike at any sign of defiance. To live on the island was to live under constant negotiation with stronger empires. Every feast at court, every treaty signed, every marriage proposal was touched by the fear of invasion. In this climate, Charlotte's girlhood became training for survival. She walked through corridors filled with spies, listened to council meetings where every word had hidden meanings, and saw how even relatives could become enemies. The island's beauty, its olive groves, its azure seas, was always framed by the knowledge that enemies desired it as much as her family loved it. By the time Charlotte reached adolescence, she was no longer a child shielded by innocence. She was a princess forged in suspicion, her destiny shadowed by the rivals she could not escape and the enemies who circled like vultures. Cyprus was her inheritance, but it was also her prison, and the walls of Nicosia whispered of battles yet to come. In 1458, when King John II of Cyprus died, the fragile kingdom stood at a crossroads. The court gathered in Nicosia, the bells of St. Sophia Cathedral tolling, and a 14-year-old girl was led to the throne. Charlotte of Lusignan, still in the bloom of youth, was crowned Queen of Cyprus, Jerusalem, and Armenia. 3 titles bound not to her strength, but to centuries of Crusader legacy. The crown rested heavy on her head, a golden symbol of both triumph and danger. The image was magnificent. A teenage queen robed in velvet, her face pale and resolute, holding a scepter that represented kingdoms she would never truly control. But behind the pageantry lurked doubt. Nobles looked at her with skepticism. Could a girl, barely more than a child, command loyalty in a land contested by rival factions? Foreign envoys whispered that her reign would be short, that Cyprus was ripe for plucking by greater powers. Her half-brother James, the bastard son of John II, seized upon this uncertainty. While Charlotte was paraded as the rightful heir, James was plotting, building alliances in shadows, and seeking aid from abroad. The Mamluks of Egypt, eager to influence the Eastern Mediterranean, extended their hand to him. To them, James was not just a claimant, he was a tool to fracture Cyprus from within. For Charlotte, the first months of her reign were consumed by survival. Every decision, every council meeting was a test of her legitimacy. She was no longer a girl studying languages and rituals. She was a sovereign under siege. The weight of 3 crowns pressed against her temples, reminding her that history expected her to hold what even grown men had struggled to defend. Yet there was courage in her youth. Accounts describe her as eloquent, strong-willed, and unyielding when challenged. She inherited her mother's sharpness and her father's name, and she believed, perhaps naively, that legitimacy would triumph over ambition. Standing in the cathedral on the day of her coronation, she embodied both hope and fragility, the last flame of Lusignan authority flickering against the winds of betrayal. Her reign began not with celebration, but with suspicion. Her throne was a beacon that drew predators, and Charlotte was forced to learn quickly what many rulers discover too late: that the crown is less a gift than a burden, and that power is never secure, especially for those born to inherit it rather than seize it. By 1459, Charlotte and her advisors knew that her crown alone could not shield her. The whispers of rebellion grew louder, the threat of James more immediate. To fortify her rule, she turned to the oldest weapon of monarchs: marriage. Her hand was offered to Louis of Savoy, a scion of a powerful European house whose name carried prestige and whose family connections promised support. The union was celebrated with ceremony, banners unfurled, and blessings pronounced. Yet beneath the ritual, this marriage was not about love. It was a transaction: Charlotte's throne for Louis's protection, her crown in exchange for his dynasty's recognition. In theory, it was a brilliant move, tying Cyprus to Western Europe, balancing against the looming pressure of Egypt and Venice. But the reality was far less secure. Louis of Savoy was no warrior king, no political genius. Accounts portray him as weak, indecisive, and unsuited for the storm Charlotte was facing. Rather than rallying the nobility, he alienated them. Instead of projecting strength, he revealed uncertainty. His inability to command loyalty left Charlotte vulnerable, her enemies emboldened, and her allies disheartened. The marriage also failed in its most personal measure. It produced no children. With each passing year, the absence of an heir deepened her sense of fragility. Dynasties endure through bloodlines, and without one, Charlotte's throne appeared even more unstable. The nobles who had doubted her now found new reasons to whisper. Not only was she young, but she was childless. Her line threatened with extinction. Charlotte's dream of marriage as a shield soon became a bitter irony. The man meant to protect her became a liability, and the union she hoped would anchor her reign turned into a fragile thread, fraying with every political failure. She had tied herself to a partner who could not match her resolve, and the burden of rule remained hers alone. In this disillusionment, Charlotte's tragedy sharpened. She was still a teenager, forced to carry the weight of kingdoms, betrayed by the very alliance meant to save her. The marriage did not secure her throne, it exposed its cracks. And behind those cracks, James waited, sharpening his blade of ambition, ready to strike. James, the illegitimate son of John II, had long been dismissed as the bastard of Cyprus. Yet, illegitimacy in law did not prevent him from gathering power in practice. Where Charlotte's authority rested on fragile ceremony, James's strength came from alliances, opportunism, and the calculated resentment of those who felt excluded under her rule. He found his greatest ally in the Mamluks of Egypt. To Cairo, Cyprus was not simply an island. It was a gateway to trade, influence, and strategic dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. By supporting James, they saw an opportunity to place a puppet on the throne, a king indebted to them for his very crown. Their fleets and wealth became the foundation of James's rebellion. Inside Cyprus, noble families began to drift toward James's cause. Some resented Charlotte's Byzantine mother. Others doubted the strength of her marriage to Louis of Savoy. James promised them power, privileges, and a share in whatever order he would build. Slowly, the Queen's court began to empty, and the balance of loyalty shifted. The rebellion unfolded quickly. From the fortified city of Famagusta to the countryside estates, whispers of support for James hardened into open defiance. Battles erupted, and Charlotte's forces, already weak, struggled to hold the island together. Unlike her, James did not hesitate. He recruited mercenaries, welcomed foreign aid, and pressed every advantage without remorse. For Charlotte, it was a devastating betrayal. Her half-brother was not an outsider storming her kingdom. He was family, flesh of her father's blood. His rebellion was a knife twisted not only into her reign, but into the very bond of kinship. She had believed legitimacy was stronger than ambition. James proved her wrong. By 1464, the rebellion had consumed Cyprus. Charlotte's troops were scattered, her treasury drained, and her confidence battered by constant defeat. The nobility who once swore loyalty now stood at her brother's side. The Mamluks pressed their advantage, ensuring that James could not be easily dislodged. At last, Charlotte was left with no choice but flight. Abandoning her palace, her court, and her island, she fled into exile. What she carried with her was not gold or armies, but the hollow titles of Queen of Cyprus, Jerusalem, and Armenia. Words without power, crowns without substance. She had lost her throne not on the battlefield of foreign conquest, but in the betrayal of her own blood. Exile brought Charlotte to Rome, a city of grandeur and decay, where the weight of history pressed upon every stone. The Pope received her with ceremony, addressing her as the rightful Queen of Cyprus. But in truth, she was a monarch without a kingdom, a petitioner in search of salvation. She lived in borrowed palaces, sustained by papal patronage and the occasional sympathy of European rulers. At first, promises abounded. Crusades were whispered of, fleets were promised, soldiers pledged. Each delegation that greeted her assured her that restoration was near, that justice would come. Yet the years passed, and the promises dissolved like smoke. Rome itself was both stage and prison. Charlotte maintained the rituals of sovereignty, audiences, letters, formal petitions. She signed decrees for a kingdom she no longer ruled, held court in exile, and reminded all who would listen that she was still queen. Yet behind the dignity lay dependence. Every meal, every garment, every soldier who might be dispatched in her name came not from her own coffers, but from the charity of others. For a woman raised to believe in the permanence of crowns, the humiliation was profound. She was bowed to, yet pitied, honored, yet powerless. Her words carried the weight of tradition, but none of enforcement. When she spoke of Cyprus, it was as a memory, not as a realm she commanded. Still, she did not abandon hope. Letters to European courts flowed ceaselessly, appeals to Venice, to France, to the papacy. She became a symbol of endurance, a queen clinging to her titles as though words alone could reverse her exile. Diplomats respected her persistence, but they also recognized the futility. The age of crusaders was fading, and the appetite for restoring Cyprus was gone. In the streets of Rome, Charlotte was a familiar figure. Regal yet isolated, a queen among commoners, walking with the grace of sovereignty but with none of its substance. Her exile was not a sharp wound, but a slow erosion, the steady dissolution of identity. She was a monarch without a throne, a sovereign without power, and a woman forced to live each day as both a reminder of lost glory and a witness to the indifference of the world. In Rome, Charlotte's life settled into a rhythm of ceremonial persistence and private despair. She was still called Your Majesty, still treated as a queen in formal audiences, yet the substance of her sovereignty had vanished. Day after day, she performed the rituals of monarchy in exile, signing decrees for a kingdom she no longer ruled, granting titles that carried no authority, and composing letters that returned with polite refusals. Her court in exile was small, a fragment of what had once surrounded her in Nicosia. Loyal attendants followed her, clinging to the hope that restoration might someday arrive. They dressed in faded finery, attended her in ceremonies, and maintained the fiction of power. Yet behind closed doors, the truth was clear. Theirs was a court of shadows, a theater of memory performed for an audience that no longer cared. Charlotte became a symbol of endurance, but also of futility. She visited churches to pray for divine intervention, walked through Roman streets with the dignity of a sovereign, and received diplomats who offered sympathy without substance. Her petitions to the Pope, to the kings of France and Aragon, to Venice and Genoa, all carried the same refrain: "Restore me to Cyprus." The replies, though courteous, were hollow. The age of crusades was gone. No one would launch a war for her cause. Each year deepened her isolation. James, now firmly on the Cypriot throne with Mamluk backing, strengthened his position. Charlotte's name faded from treaties, her titles whispered only in formalities. Even among allies, she was remembered less as a reigning queen and more as a relic of a bygone era. The silence of exile became her constant companion. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of neglect. A silence heavier than battle drums, more suffocating than political defeat. Rome honored her presence, but ignored her pleas. She lived in the paradox of being remembered enough to be pitied, but forgotten enough to remain powerless. Her tragedy was not only that she lost her throne, but that she was forced to live decades afterward as its ghost. A queen who no longer ruled, a sovereign reduced to ceremony, Charlotte endured the cruelest exile of all. One not marked by violence, but by silence. As the years passed, Charlotte's personal tragedy became entwined with the collapse of her dynasty. Her marriage to Louis of Savoy had produced no children, leaving her without an heir to carry the Lusignan line. The proud dynasty that had once ruled Cyprus since the Crusades, that had borne the crowns of Jerusalem and Armenia, now stood on the edge of extinction. Charlotte understood this with painful clarity. She had been raised to safeguard a dynasty, yet in her lifetime, she saw its foundations crumble. With each passing year, the Lusignan legacy grew weaker, not from conquest alone, but from within. From infertility, betrayal, and the relentless erosion of power. Meanwhile, the world around her shifted. Venice, already dominant in Mediterranean trade, tightened its grip on Cypriot affairs, preparing for the day when James's reign would falter. Beyond them loomed the Ottomans, expanding with relentless force, their shadow stretching across the eastern Mediterranean. For Charlotte, it was a bitter irony. She was still Queen of Jerusalem and Armenia in name. Yet those titles had become nothing more than hollow echoes of a vanished crusader past. Her court in exile continued its ceremonies. They spoke of Cyprus as though it could be regained, of dynastic restoration as though it were still possible. But Charlotte knew better. She was aging, childless, and increasingly powerless. Every letter she sent to European courts seemed to vanish into the abyss of disinterest. The urgency of her plight had faded, drowned by larger wars and shifting alliances. The end of the Lusignan dynasty did not come with a decisive battle or a violent coup. It ended quietly, in the slow unraveling of time, in the absence of heirs, in the neglect of allies. Charlotte's life was the epitaph of her family's rule. A reign lost not in conquest, but in erosion. By the time she entered her 40s, she was no longer a queen in exile demanding restoration. She had become something more tragic, a living witness to her dynasty's extinction. The Lusignan line that had once claimed Crusader glory would end with her. And she knew that when she died, the titles she carried would become little more than ceremonial relics, remembered only in rituals no one truly believed in. Her legacy, she feared, would not be one of triumph or resilience, but of disappearance. A queen who carried the ashes of her dynasty until her final breath. On July 16, 1487, Charlotte of Cyprus breathed her last in Rome. She was only 43 years old. Still young by the standards of queens, yet aged by years of struggle, humiliation, and exile. Her death did not come on a battlefield, nor in the splendor of a palace. It came quietly, far from the city of her birth, far from the island she had once ruled. She was buried in the church of San Gregorio al Celio, a sanctuary in Rome that had received many forgotten exiles. There were no royal processions, no weeping crowds in Nicosia, no kingdom-wide mourning. The queen of 3 kingdoms was laid to rest in a foreign land, her grave marked by silence rather than sovereignty. The tragedy was not only in her death, but in the absence of remembrance. Charlotte had once been crowned with the weight of Jerusalem and Armenia. Yet at her passing, those titles rang hollow. The courts of Europe scarcely acknowledged her demise. Rome provided her a burial, but not the honor of restoration. Her homeland was lost to her, and so too was her legacy. Meanwhile, Cyprus continued without her. James, the half-brother who had usurped her throne, ruled under foreign influence, and Venice tightened its grip on the island until it became little more than another piece in the Mediterranean game. The Lusignan dynasty, which had stretched for centuries, was effectively gone with Charlotte. Her crown, once so dazzling, had turned to dust in her lifetime. For those who had served her in exile, her death was a final curtain. They mourned not only their queen, but also the cause they had carried for decades, a dream of return that would never come. With her passing, their roles dissolved into anonymity. They had followed a sovereign who lived as a shadow, and now that shadow was extinguished. Charlotte of Cyprus died not as a reigning monarch, but as an exile, and history consigned her to silence. Her story, like her grave in Rome, was hidden in plain sight, a reminder that the end of dynasties often comes not in blood and fire, but in the quiet burial of a queen far from her throne. Charlotte's legacy is not one of conquest, glory, or enduring power. It is the legacy of erasure, of a queen who carried the weight of crowns without the strength of armies to defend them. She was the last flame of the Lusignan dynasty, extinguished not in a single blow, but in the slow suffocation of exile. Her tragedy lies in contrasts. Crowned at 14, she ruled 3 kingdoms in name, but lost them within 6 years. Married for strength, she gained only weakness. Born to continue a dynasty, she produced no heirs. For every symbol of sovereignty she carried, there was a reality of loss that undermined it. And yet, her life speaks to a larger truth about history. Not all tragedies are written in blood on battlefields. Some are written in silence, in neglect, in the empty halls of exile. Charlotte did not die violently, but perhaps her fate was crueler. to live as a queen without a kingdom, to walk through Rome as a sovereign unrecognized, to be remembered only as an exiled queen. This was her punishment and her epitaph. Her story also reflects the fragility of kingdoms themselves. Cyprus, Jerusalem, Armenia, names that once carried the weight of the Crusades, that once commanded armies and inspired faith, had become hollow rituals in her lifetime. A young girl's coronation could not stop the tide of history, the rise of empires, the fall of dynasties, the relentless pull of foreign ambition. Charlotte bore witness to that decline, embodying in her own life the collapse of an era. Today, Charlotte of Cyprus is remembered faintly, if at all, a figure consigned to the margins of history books, overshadowed by greater empires and louder tragedies. But her life remains a haunting reminder of the human cost of power, that crowns can weigh heavier than chains, and that to be forgotten can be a fate more final than death. Her legacy endures not in the kingdoms she lost, but in the lessons she leaves behind, that even queens, wrapped in velvet and crowned in gold, can vanish into silence, remembered only as whispers in the corridors of history.